Hi, and welcome to Metamorphosis series on integrating systems to support students. Today's session will be focusing on developing a strong Tier 1 so that we can meet the needs of all our students. I'm Gail Angus, and I'm here with
Kelly Perales.
And let me give a little background of who I am real quickly. I work with school districts with implementing multi-tiered systems of supports or tiered systems of supports like PBIS, MTSS, RTI is probably a better way to say that. Supporting leaders with the structures that they need to focus on as they're implementing these systems. And so today, our webinar is going to be focusing on what is needed to build that strong Tier 1 system that's inclusive and meets the needs of all your students. We're going to be focusing on key components of the system, such as assessment, data, teaming structures, as well as giving you a way to audit your system. So let's first establish what is a Tier 1 foundation. And so as Kelly and I talk today, we're going to be talking about Tier 1 from a place of it being universal. It's looking at both academics, behavior, and social emotional. The goal is that it's meeting the needs of all your students. It's built off of research-based practices and programs, and at least 80% are meeting benchmark. We're talking all students are participating in your Tier 1. The reason why we want to do this is that it does create those inclusive environments for your staff, for your students, and for your community, as well as it is very proactive and preventative. It provides that early intervention, it minimizes students from failing, and best of all, it's keeping students in school as well as in their least restrictive environment, AKA general education, as much as possible. When we are talking about Tier 1, we're talking about our expectations and standards that we expect all students to meet. We're talking about instruction as well as intervention. Yes, intervention does happen in Tier 1, as well as in Tier 2 and Tier 3. And we're need assessments and the data from those assessments so that our teams can make data-based decisions. So these 5 components make up a Tier 1. Today, like I said, we're going to focus a lot on the assessment, the data, and the teaming in those decisions. But before we dive into those components, I want to remind you as a leader who is leading the implementation of MTSS, PBIS, RTI, whatever tiered response you're looking at, you need to make sure that you have identified your why. Why are you doing this work? That you are not just doing this alone, that you have that team that's coming along with you to help with this implementation. And that as a team, you as a leader and your team are removing the barriers, that you're ensuring that your staff have the skills that they need and that your students are receiving the support that they need to be successful. And you're ensuring that the processes are being followed, that what you built is truly what is happening and occurring. So I'm going to hand this over to Kelly to dig deeper into some data decision making.
Thanks, Gail. And I'm happy to be here sharing with you today and look forward to discussing this further when we can all convene to have some conversation and talk through successes and challenges and answer any questions you might have. I am an implementing partner with the Center on Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, We are a technical assistance center funded out of the U.S. Department of Education, and I work for the Midwest PBIS network. We're one of the hubs of the center where not only do we support the technical assistance in that way, but also have other research and grant funded projects, as well as direct contracts with states and regions and districts who, just like Gail, are trying to support the efforts within districts and schools to implement multi-tiered systems of supports for academics, social, emotional, behavioral health, and wellness. And so we're going to transition now to talking a little bit about data. And Gail, I know you really wanted to touch on the rationales. Why is this important?
Oh, thank you, Kelly, for that reminder. We need to be looking at data. Those database decision making, it's part of any tiered support, especially a multi-tiered system. It helps us to identify our strengths as a system, as well as the strengths of our students, as well as identify the gaps that we may have in our system and the gaps that possibly students have that we have to intervene or provide more support with. And lastly, data and database decision making helps us to demonstrate as well as celebrate the impacts and the outcomes of our students, the impact our work is making, and the wonderful outcomes our students are receiving. So when we look at data, there's really two reasons to dig into it individually, but more importantly, as a team, is to ponder what is the effectiveness of the instruction of our system, the work that we're doing. Is it really addressing the needs of our students? And then, secondly, identifying our students who may need a little bit more support, both with interventions as well as extension.
Okay, let's get into then some various types of data that might be available already for teams to examine when informing their decisions about how they're going to build a strong core, because that's what we're talking about here today. And so the first is student outcome data, of course, right? As you are putting in your core instruction at Tier 1, the lessons that you're teaching every student for academics and core instruction, you're going to be assessing how they're responding to that instruction. And then you're going to be structuring, maybe you need to reteach a lesson to an entire classroom or an entire grade level. And so that is one piece of outcome data that's really important. When we're looking at non-academics, how are students responding in terms of being productive citizens and having problem-solving skills and pro-social skills and coping strategies? And so you might also have to consider other types of data that's outside of school in order to examine outcomes as well. We're also going to touch on a little bit the idea of universal screening. This is something that we do at Tier 1. Schools do this for vision and hearing. They do it for reading and math. And also we encourage schools to screen for social, emotional, behavioral risk. Now, screening data is not meant to be evaluative. It's one data point and should be used in conjunction with other data when making those assessments around which students might need more support, or what does that screening data tell you about what you need at Tier 1. Perception data. This is information that we might be gathering from staff, from families, from students themselves. What do they perceive about things like culture and climate, about the curriculum, about communication, about how well they feel they're connected to the school community? Belonging is an important piece of the success for students within school. And so what type of perception data is your school collecting, and how are you using that to inform decisions? And the final data piece here is around implementation fidelity. Are we doing what we said we would do? How is our system functioning? And how closely are we as adults within schools ensuring that the evidence-based practices that we're using, whether that's, again, academic curriculum or some type of, you know, problem-solving strategy, is being done to fidelity. Here are some ideas, and this is just an example about other types of data that you might consider. And so on the left in that column, you'll see the traditional types of school data that most schools look at. If you're expanding your data within school, again, it might be through the use of universal screening. It might be those perception surveys. It might be something like looking at visits to the school nurse, if you have one, for those students who might have what we call internalizing concerns. They could be struggling with anxiety or depression, but they're not having acting out problem behavior, or they're not going to show up in the typical traditional data that's listed there in the left-hand column. And so, what ways are students sort of socially appropriately removing themselves from the classroom environment, but going to seek out support in other ways? And then you'll see there in the far right column some ideas about types of community data that school teams could examine in order to inform what they might be doing at Tier 1 for all students. Here's an example from a school who was pulling in some community data. This had to do with child welfare reports and the ways in which the school was starting to track a particular kind of time period and neighborhood where there had been an uptick in responses from child welfare, and trying to make some plans around how to address those needs, and then tracking that data over time based on their plan. Here's another example of some community data. This comes from shortly after schools returned to in-person learning after things had been shut down during the spring of 2020. And so they were tracking things like not only COVID rates, but also mental health hospitalizations, changes in homelessness rates, changes in unemployment rates, and the ways in which the impact of that period of time was impacting the community. One final example here, this is student perception data, and this was a question around belonging and the school putting into place an intervention where they were trying to impact and improve students' own perception of their belonging within school. And so, Gail, I think it's important, some of the things that you said early on around how to rely on a team to examine data and use it for decision making. And I think these questions here that you have were really to sort of say to our audience today, think about the data you have access to. Or if you don't have access to the data, how are you going to get your hands on it? And what kinds of conversations is your team having so that you can use this information and this data to inform the plans you have and the decisions that you're making? What else would you say about this here, Gail?
I think it's also a very important to look at with the data that you identify, who's looking at it, how are you using it, what changes do you need to make so that you get to the level of use of data that you are making data decisions. Is there time that you need to create for teams to come together? Is it that you need to make it more usable where they can look at the data easily, and that accessibility of it as well? So kind of look at what you have currently, and based off of what Kelly and I have been sharing, what adjustments or changes, additions do you need to create? Even what trainings do you need to have for your staff to ensure that we are looking at data so that we can have a strong tier 1. So Kelly, let's dig into the teaming around looking at that data. As we jump into what the teams, what the purpose of the team and the types of conversations that we can have around data. One purpose is for our school improvement teams, our school level teams, but even I'm going to push on district level administrators. District level administrators should also be looking at data across the district in the same way we want our schools to be looking at their data so that you also can be providing that support. So looking at having those improvement team conversations. There could be conversations between the teacher and the supervisor in looking at what supports does a particular class may need or what support a particular staff member may need or a student may need. We would want our department and grade level teams coming together and looking at data to say, hey, this is what standards we're focusing on, or what instructional strategies we've been utilizing, or what interventions we've been using for reteaching purposes, or even strategies around behavior, as well as having conversations around individual students or groups of students in a grade level or a department who may be struggling with their learning. And lastly, having conversations even with our students around their individual data so that they can own their own learning. So these are 5 types of ways that we do have data conversations. As we move forward, we're going to be focusing on that school improvement as well as our department and grade levels coming together and having conversations around their data.
Thanks, Gail. I'm going to move quickly through some of these next slides. I want to really respect and honor that those of you who are listening in have taken the time to hear these messages, and I look forward to talking more, as I said, with you about them when we convene. And some of these next slides, you can certainly refer back to them as resources. It's important when you're organizing your team or already have a team in place that you're thinking about if anyone is missing from the team. You want to ensure that you have folks with authority and expertise who can offer their perspective and their guidance around the decisions that you're making. And so if you already have some teams in existence, you might want to take some time to say, what are our teams all about? Who's on them? What is their goal? What are we trying to accomplish? Because you could find that you have some of the same people meeting multiple times during the week, and that some of the conversation is similar, and there could be opportunities for efficiencies. And so we call this activity working smarter, not harder, and how you might try to coordinate your efforts in a way that cuts down on everyone's workload. Another important piece is, for the purpose of today, we're really focused on Tier 1. That's all students, all staff, all settings of your school. And during these conversations, this is not the time to talk about one student at a time. In fact, a general rule of thumb would be that no students are named by name at all, because you are talking about your system and you're talking about data in a universal way. And so it's a really great opportunity to have family members who are active participants of your team, as well as community members, because you certainly don't need to worry about if a student's name is mentioned, because you're really sticking to that universal conversation. And so another activity that your team might do is to say, who's on our team? What are the practices that we're talking about in this team conversation? What are our data decision rules for deciding when a student needs something more? And what do we have in place that we're going to turn that to so that we're not spending the time in our agenda focused on something that's for a different conversation or a different team? Here are some defined roles that you want to consider when your team meets. This can help you with efficiencies. We know that teams don't often have a lot of time. Maybe you only have 30 or 45 minutes for a team meeting. And so we draw from the team initiated problem solving process for these roles. And it's important to think about who on your team can facilitate and lead the conversation, who can take notes, who can help you stay on task and keep you on time. Do you have a representative group? And in this example here, who's coordinating various interventions so that you can rely on them to summarize and bring information and data to the conversation so that you don't have to spend your time going through all of that, which just kind of eats away from the primary focus of your problem solving. Here's an example of what these various roles might do before, during, and after the meeting. This could be a handy resource, again, to help you be efficient. I sometimes hear people say, did we really need to have a meeting or could that have been an email, right? And so what are the things that you can do outside of the meeting to get the work done so that you can really focus in the meeting on having someone have organized that data in a meaningful way so that you can really focus in on what is it that you're trying to solve during your time together. And so here again, this comes from the team initiated problem solving process in that we want to move away from, okay, team, here we are for our team meeting. This is the problem. Let's brainstorm ideas to solve it, to getting really clear and precise about what is the data telling us? What can we set as a measurable goal? Let's create a plan or multiple plans, set it in place, monitor the fidelity, and set a time for when you're going to come back in a future meeting to say, did we do what we said we would do? And did we accomplish what our goal was? Or where do we need to make adjustments? And so again, I would encourage all of you, expand the type of data that you're looking at as a team and use all of that data to inform the decisions you're making for that strong core at tier 1. And then once you have your routine around when and how you're using your data, think about the ways in which you can disaggregate it by subgroups, especially those subgroups who are the most vulnerable or at risk. And so that might depend on where you are, but it could be by race, by disability status, by gender, and think about whether or not you have over or under representation of any of your subgroups within your data. And then think about what your process is going to be for your problem solving so that you can have your routines and procedures and become, in that habit of how you're doing your problem solving. All right, Gail.
So we're going to quickly segue into where can you begin today to audit your system, to support your system with next steps around assessment, data, and your teaming structure. So Kelly, can
Yeah,
you
so here's
share a
an
little bit about
example.
this?
And you heard Gail say when we introduced ourselves at the start of our time together, you might be focusing in on academics. You might be focusing in on social skill instruction. You might be focusing in on how you're going to address the impact of trauma in your school. Regardless of your initiative, what are the ways that you are thinking about what you're doing for all, for some, and for a few? And so here is an example of what it might look like within a school who has multiple initiatives and is thinking about how they're responding to their need. One thing that you might want to consider is an activity called resource mapping. And so, again, here's a little bit about what it is and some rationales for why it's important. And then there's a couple of slides here for how you might go about it. And this is an example, and it's only about social emotional behavior supports and what interventions a school has across tiers and just kind of spelling it out for everyone so that it's very clear. And then they can analyze, do we have any gaps? Do we have a data point where we're not addressing some need? Uh, and it's also important, Gail, if you'll go to the next slide, please, to think about, how are we defining a practice, an intervention, a service, or some other activity? Because they're not all the same. And it's important for you to think through and clearly articulate what it is that you're doing for your students. And so again, we're going to kind of keep us moving here, but some guiding questions that might be useful for you if you focus on an activity such as this.
And if you've been following the series through Metamorphics, in session 1, we did an activity that focuses similar to that resource mapping, where you are looking at what are we providing around academics, behavior, social, emotional, for all of the different areas, the expectation standards, instruction, intervention, assessment and data, and your teams. So this is just another tool, a different way to look at it, if this would help you. Plus, we talked about how to do this in session 1, mapping out your resource in regards to staff, who is available in all of these areas to support. So it's just another tool. It is available under our session 1 if you are interested in looking at that. So as we wrap up, I just want to come back and look at what we talked about really quick. As a leader, you need to harness the strength of your staff and your family. So bring others along with you as you move forward with this implementation. You need to make sure that you are deepening those connections with them so that they feel part of not this happening to them, but it is happening with them. And through all of this work, you want to ensure that you are creating that connection and that engagement for every student, so that students are known, but also staff is known across a site and a district. And the more that we feel connection and belonging, that reduces some of that stress that prevents us from engaging in the work. Also, we want to make sure that your instruction and your interventions are in place. And all of these pieces need to be there so that when we are looking at data, one, we have data to look at. But you're looking at data in all of those areas so that you can make adjustments as needed. And that your teams are trained on the process of looking at data and what to do with it during those meetings. So this is just a quick recap. And both mine and Kelly's contact information are connected at the end of these slides. And as Kelly mentioned, we look forward to having conversation with you when we reconvene to dig deeper and to respond to your questions. Kelly, any?
Thank you all. Take care.